Now, a real fight is brewing in Pennsylvania. This is over Senator Arlen Specter's Senate seat. Mr. Specter defected. He's not a Republican anymore. He's a Democrat. Joining us now, two men hoping to replace him, Democratic Congressman Joe Sestak and former Republican Congressman Pat Toomey. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to see both of you. And let me just begin. From an investor's standpoint, is President Obama to blame for the collapsing dollar and the record gold price? I believe this is a political issue. Joe Sestak, what's your thinking on this?
No, absolutely not. This president inherited a $10 trillion debt that had been doubled when the Republican leadership threw out the pay-as-you-go agreement and never balanced the 2001, 2003 tax cuts, nor did it balance the Medicare D-prescription drugs. And they ran the economy aground. So he has put in a short-term stimulus package that has brought us back to where LIBOR used to be last September. A year ago, it shot up on 26 September to 6.5%. It's below, it's only 0.15%. And second, where unemployment had been 700,000 new jobs losses every month for the first 3 months, we're down about 250. Do we have to get our long-term debt addressed? Without a question, it should be the top domestic issue, and this president should have set the stage better for that. But we had to get the ship sailing again.
All right, let me come to that. And well said, by the way, as a former admiral, which we love about you, by the way. Pat Toomey, let me bring you in. You heard Ms. Sestak. I want to ask you, is it Obama's dollar? Is it Obama's gold price? And what do you, how do you respond to Mr. Sestak's support of Obama?
I think it is. First of all, in the years that I was in the House, the biggest deficit we ever ran was about 3% of GDP. This year alone, it's going to be 11%, probably bigger. And Joe and his liberal colleagues are advocating absolutely unsustainable spending, whole new entitlement programs, big tax increases, protectionist trade policy, cap and trade that would put huge new burdens on energy and industrial production. Larry, an economy can only withstand so much, and I think the market is telling us that this is unsustainable. The amount of debt, the unfunded liabilities of the big entitlement programs, the threat of adding new ones, the danger is that at some level somebody's going to propose that we default on some of this in one way or another. And, of course, one way you can do that is to debase your currency. And I sure think that's a terrible approach, but I worry that the market thinks that that's where we're heading.
Joe Sestak, you mentioned at the tail end, I've got to give Pat equal time. You can appreciate that, but I want to circle back. You're not happy with President Obama on the debt issue. Is that correct? Will you support a debt limitation? That's going to be coming up for legislation. Just expand on that. Are you separating yourself from Mr. Obama? And then we'll get to Arlen Specter.
Without a question, this president and President Bush should have also set getting our debt back into out of arrears as a top domestic priority. I think he couldn't do it this year, but he should have addressed it, that it is going to be addressed next year. Look, to Pat's comments, I appreciate his opinion, but he's not entitled to his own set of facts. And the facts are, quite frankly, that President Bush's, with 3% GDP that you said was the deficit, that's what President Obama's is next year and the following year and the following year. Predictions.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. Excuse me, you're right. Next year is 10%. After that, it's 3% each year.
No, it's not going to collapse to 3 from 10 overnight.
I'm sorry, Pat, it does. And here's what it does. Both President Bush's and President Obama's actually would have gotten us to 82% of our GDP and national debt. I think both plans were flawed if we don't get our domestic national debt under control. But I'm sorry, Pat, it actually is.
Pat Toomey,
to say anything else is wrong.
Here's the problem.
Pat Toomey, what would you do about the debt right now? I think that it's a valid point that this extraordinary bulge in debt is having a very negative impact on the dollar. Now, I also agree with Mr. Sestak. The dollar's decline was chronic during the Bush years also.
There's truth to that.
Right, I know. Tell me what you would do about the debt problem, Pat.
Well, first of all, let's be clear. I mean, Joe is bemoaning the size of the deficit, but he supported the TARP. He supported all the bailouts. He supported the stimulus spending, supported a gigantic budget. This is a staggering amount and unsustainable amount of spending. I think we've got to get spending under control. You know, historically, federal government has spent something on the order of 20% of GDP. This year, it's going to be closer to 28%. You can't sustain these gigantic bulges in spending. And frankly, it's not, increasing government borrowing and spending is not going to grow our way out of this.
Joe?
So I think the stimulus that hasn't been spent should be rescinded. We ought to be looking at pro-growth tax policy instead. But just growing government is not going to get us a recovery.
When Pat was in office in the Congress, In 2001, the CBO said that if we continue the Clinton administration's policies, in 2008 we had $5.4 trillion surplus. Pat and his GOP leadership ended up, when President Obama came over, actually adding $10 trillion to the national debt. So it's kind of harsh for him and disingenuous to say that now that we had to, with the ship sinking, had to plug the hole with quick stimulus money to get the employment down to get us going again. Do I agree that in the longer term, starting next year, we have to then take the tough decisions on entitlement spending? What tax increases or revenues do we need to balance it? What programs do we have to cut?
You want tax increases?
Well, I think that when Pat voted that 53% of all tax increases, cuts over the last 8 years went to the top 1% of wage earners, the millionaires, that's not right.
I got 30 seconds. I got to give the last word to Pat Toomey.
Joe has advocated higher taxes on income, on wages, on capital. I think the tax cuts that we passed in 2003, tax cuts for everybody who paid taxes, helped grow the economy. And Larry, as you know, the federal government took in more revenue after we cut the taxes
and they gave us a $10 trillion
and
debt.
Growing massive government, creating unsustainable new entitlements, huge new debt. Protectionism on the trade front, denying workers a secret ballot.
You left us with such a big mess back here. We've got to fix up.
When Mr. Sestak defeats Mr. Specter, you two guys are going to run. It'll be a great primary, great general election debate.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Joe Sestak,
Good to see you,
Pat Toomey,
Pat.
terrific stuff.